I didn't expect to retire as a lawyer, that's which I did at the end of last year. When I graduated high school, I expected to retire, hopefully, as a senior military officer. And I had the opportunity to do that, but Vietnam changed my life. I grew up in Joplin, loved the Boy Scouts, was very much involved. And when I was 16 years old, the Scouts nationwide had a speaking contest. The subject was patriotism. There are 12 sections of the country that are, the Scouts are divided into 12 regions actually. Region 8 was where I was. And I happened to have the good fortune of winning the contest. What was the reward? The reward for all 12 of us was a trip to Washington, D.C. to present the report to the nation for the Boy Scouts of America for 1961 to President Kennedy in the Oval Office. It was an awesome experience for all of us who were 16 years old. We got to meet other dignitaries while we were in D.C., but there was a sidebar, a trip to West Point. And while there, I was able to meet with the Superintendent General William Westmoreland, who later would be the Commander-in-Chief of all troops in Vietnam. During my time there, he invited me and others, encouraged us to seek an appointment and become a cadet. And I thought that was impressive. West Point is obviously an impressive place. But I wasn't sure. However, I went back to D.C. before I went back to Joplin and happened to be invited to make a speech at the Mayflower Hotel to a group of congressmen and business executives. After the speech was over, my congressman came up and introduced himself. I certainly hadn't met him before, and took me to the Capitol for lunch. Asked me what I was doing, had been doing, and I told him, including a reference to West Point. He then started asking me questions about West Point, and finally just looked at me and said, "Do you want to go?" And I said, I don't know that much of it. I'll think about it. I stayed in touch with him. The next year, I was fortunate enough to obtain another award being presented in Washington, D.C. to me by the Vice President, Lyndon Johnson. This time, my congressman escorted me to the event and again took me to the Capitol for lunch and wanted to talk about West Point. By then, I had decided that I would try to go. And he gave me an appointment, and I went, not knowing hardly anything about Vietnam. I knew where it was on the map, and I'd read a few things in the paper, but it was still too early before our big build-up there. At any rate,
this was what time? What year was this?
1961. But when plebe year was over and we became upperclassmen, we began to learn a great deal more. We learned that the previous classes, the majority of the cadets, when they became second lieutenants, within a year of graduation, were sent to Vietnam, and the casualties were heavy. As a senior, I had the good fortune of being selected as the first captain of the Corps. There was a tradition that went back a long way to Pershing, MacArthur, Westmoreland, and others, that the first captain would elect to be in the infantry. And I did not want to break that tradition, so I elected the infantry. And my first stop was Fort Benning to become a paratrooper. After that, I went to the Ranger School for 9 weeks, became a Ranger, and then went to the 101st Airborne Division in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, as an infantry platoon leader. That didn't last very long. Within 4 months, I was on my way to Vietnam, still in the 101st Airborne Division, and still an infantry platoon leader.
What year was this?
This would have been 1967.
Okay.
I was in there for a year, And I had 3 days to acclimate myself to the climate and to meet my platoon. The 4th day was my first mission, which lasted 47 days, involved a number of firefights, a very large one on the very first day. The tactics that we were using, search and destroy was what it was called. And what does that mean? You look for the enemy and you kill them. Nothing else. No trying to get to the hearts and minds of the people. And we learned very quickly that the South Vietnamese did not want us there. They wanted us to go home because all we were doing was killing people, burning villages, spreading Agent Orange to defoliate valleys. We were not doing anything positive for them. And we weren't staying in any one place long enough to do anything more. We always went through the jungle because the trails and paths were booby-trapped. And that meant we had to use our machetes. And we just never knew what was going to happen. If we had used different tactics, we could have won the war. But among the soldiers, it was often said, General Westmoreland, who was then the commanding general for all troops in Vietnam, it was said that General Westmoreland can't even turn around without calling Lyndon Johnson. The war was run by Washington, D.C. If we had been allowed to do what we were capable of doing, we could have won it. But we didn't. They just kept sending replacement troops to replace the ones who were killed or wounded. And by the time the war ended, almost 60,000 Americans lost their lives. I feel like I ought to talk something about my soldiers. As a platoon in Vietnam was usually 30 to 40 men. But several things caused it to be a lot less. Obviously, if someone was killed or wounded, they were removed from combat. And they knew that they had to stick together. There were no problems like you've seen in some of the movies that have been made about Vietnam. Every man knew that everybody had to be on the team and do their work. And every man, most of whom were draftees and did not want to be there, did their jobs. They were brave and courageous, and I'm so proud that I was given the opportunity to lead them. At any rate,
Okay.
the shadow of the Vietnam War, unfortunately, continues to exist. I'd like to read a brief excerpt from an essay recently written by Ken Burns, which I think states what I just said in particularly good language. The seeds of many of the troubles that beset us today, alienation, resentment, cynicism, mistrust of our government and each other, breakdown of civil discourse and civic institutions, were sown during the Vietnam War. Until we find a way to come to terms with this unsettled and enormously consequential event, its ghosts will continue to haunt us. As I said before, the Vietnam War was a mistake, well intended, but a mistake that created a horrible tragedy.